Welcome to Black Artists Lit, the podcast where we celebrate Black authors and their powerful contributions to literature. My name is Nakira Cheney, and in each episode, I'll read the first chapter of a book by an African-American author, giving you just enough to spark your curiosity, but leaving it up to you to decide if you'll dive deeper into their story. This season, we're kicking things off with Black AF History, the Un-Whitewashed Story of America by Michael Harriot. At a time when Black history is being erased from curriculums and books are being banned, this book boldly delivers the truth with wit, sharpness, and fearless honesty. If you're here to honor the stories, protect the culture, and celebrate the power of Black literature, you're in just the right place. Let's get into it, and always remember, Black art is lit. America's backstory is a whitewashed mythology implanted in our collective memory. It is a sugar-coated legend based on an almost true story. It could even be said that the devaluation and erasure of the Black experience is as American as apple pie. In this searingly smart and bitingly hilarious retelling of American history, acclaimed columnist and political commentator Michael Harriot combines unapologetically provocative storytelling with meticulous research to correct the record. Placing Black people squarely at the center, Harriot presents a more accurate version of American history. With incisive wit, Harriot speaks hilarious truth through oppressive power, subverting conventional historical narratives with little-known stories about the experiences of Black Americans. From the Africans who arrived before 1619 to the unenslavable bandit who inspired America's first police force, this long overdue addendum provides a revealing look into our past that is just as urgent as it is necessary. For too long, we have refused to acknowledge that Black history is American history, not this one. This history is Black AF. Chapter 1, Earth, Wind, and America. I have an uncle named James. For most of my life, I had no idea his name was James. To me, he was Uncle Junior. James Harriot Jr. was alternately a salesman of marijuana, a Black Panther, a Vietnam veteran, and a trusted deacon in his church. He knew things, a lot of things, like how to use a bandsaw or bait a hook with a live worm. He was infinitely more complex than that, but to me at age 10, that was the essence of my Uncle Junior. One sweltering summer day, I was visiting his house, which sat on a pond with actual peacocks running around in the yard, playing outside with my cousin. We asked Uncle Junior for some water, and he made us stand on the porch and drink it, ensuring that we were not committing the ultimate sin of Black households, running in and out that door. When he collected the drinking glasses, I remember looking through the screen door, watching him put a record on the turntable. I can never forget the music that came out. He said their names were Earth, Wind, and Fire. I want to say that Earth, Wind, and Fire is the greatest band in history, but there might be some white people reading this book, and I wouldn't want to cause any Beatle fans to have a conniption. I honestly don't know what a conniption is, but my Uncle Junior said it a lot. All I know is that it is a medical emergency that is nearly as dangerous as a hissy fit, which is the deadliest kind of fit. But this is not the time for that. This is the time for understanding that Earth, Wind, and Fire is basically Jesus-less gospel music. I'm willing to bet you aren't aware of just how many Earth, Wind, and Fire songs you know, because they are just as ubiquitous as church hymns. And to top it off, they had the three elements of all great Black music. Number 1, they wore jumpsuits. All great music acts must wear jumpsuits. It is a mandate passed down from the godfather of soul's backing band, the JBs. Since then, if you want to be great, there must be a point in your career where you must dress like a NASCAR crew that fell in a vat of sequins and rhinestones. Many people wonder why Andre 3000 dressed so weird. But I saw Outkast in his concert last summer, and Dre dressed exclusively in jumpsuits, and I realized, y'all won't let him be great. Number 2, falsetto. Prince, Eddie Kendricks, Michael Jackson, Philip Bailey, all great Black singers must have an extra octave that is reserved for the Holy Ghost and heartbreak. Number 3, a horn section. I don't care what kind of music you are playing. The fact is, everything sounds better with the horn section. Everything. Everyone since the beginning of time knows it. Ask Joshua how he brought down the walls of Jericho. Ask a soldier what instrument he once played at his funeral. Ask Jesus what sound will signal his return. Uncle Junior loved Earth, Wind, and Fire, which of course meant that I became obsessed with Earth, Wind, and Fire. And according to him, the only proper way to listen to the elements was on vinyl. Of course, he owned compact discs and cassettes and even had an 8-track tape player. But for my eldest uncle, Earth, Wind, and Fire albums should only be played in their purest form for beginning to end. Luckily, my favorite Earth, Wind, and Fire tune was the second song on the first side of their album, That's the Way of the World. Have you ever heard That's the Way of the World? If you are Black, the answer is yes. If you have ever been to a cookout, the answer is yes. If you have an aunt who owns a leather miniskirt or a leopard print blouse, the answer is yes. If you have ever smelled incense burning in a room with a ceiling fan, the answer is yes. To this day, every time I hear it, I remember what joy sounds like, what love tastes like, what home feels like. All of a sudden, I am a kid again, standing on my uncle's porch listening to my aunts tell stories through the screen door while my Uncle Junior explained the way of the world. Perhaps the only thing Uncle Junior loved more than a group he called the Elements was correcting people's story. Whenever my family members gathered, the children would usually sit on the floor while the adults entertained each other with stories that stretched back generations. And without a doubt, every time somebody got creative with their version of event, Junior was there to make sure the truth was told. When my mother recounted the tale of the time Uncle Junior brought home a skittish black cat and hid it in the bathroom closet so my grandparents wouldn't know about it, and how that cat went on to leap out in the middle of the night and nearly claw her to death, Uncle Junior reminded her that the cat was technically more of a midnight gray, and in reality, it barely scratched her. When my Aunt Marvel delighted us with the story of how my grandfather saved an entire family from a blazing house fire, he would interrupt to point out that it was mostly smoke and very free flames. He would eventually take over the story and tell it with less hyperbole. Yet still, he would somehow make his version the more interesting one. He was a living, breathing fact checker, a human footnote with impeccable storytelling technique. It was his passion. Uncle Junior wasn't necessarily a killjoy either. He was just someone who was as concerned about the fidelity of the family stories as he was about imparting the history of the sound of God's house band. In this, I would sometimes use this particular idiosyncrasy to endear myself to him. If Uncle Junior wasn't at a family gathering, I would call him up afterward and regurgitate the stories back to him while he made his corrections. I trusted his version would be the definitive version and more interesting. But truthfully, I didn't really care about the family epics as much as I just enjoyed hearing him attempt to rectify the misrepresented facts. Not only was it hilarious to me, but it gave me a chance to have one-on-one time with my uncle. This ongoing habit didn't just strengthen my storytelling muscle and inform me about my family. It also taught me to not trust anyone's version of history unless I corroborated it with an independent source, which, ironically enough, is the same method I use to learn the story of America. The true origin story of America is intriguing enough without embellishment. A tale that includes cannibalism, cross-country adventures, and a type of brazen incompetency that almost doomed this experiment in thievery. But of course, to save face and maximize profits, the story was revised until we ended up with the swashbuckling blockbuster that we now know, filled with idealistic barrel-chested white saviors who immaculately conceived of a brand new kind of democracy with nothing but a few muskets and an abundance of caucasity. Sprinkle in a few pilgrims, a handful of savage Indians, and for diversity's sake, a few Black characters who learned the value of hard work through 400 years of free labor, and you've got yourself a hit. The account of America's creation, you probably learned, starred a group of Englishmen we now call the Jamestown settlers. In the safe-for-work fairy tale edition of History of America, the English were a mighty empire who forged a new nation out of play and ingenuity. But had my Uncle Junior lived back then, he would have been like, those guys? Mighty? Nah. During their time, these so-called adventurers had garnered an international reputation for being unsuited for manual labor, let alone planning a new society. "Do not obtain your slaves from Britain," wrote Roman consul Cicero, "because they are so stupid and so utterly incapable of being taught they are not fit to form part of the household of Athens." This incompetency would create the need for a transnational human trafficking infrastructure, as well as a reasonably believable cover story to justify the intergenerational dehumanization and theft committed by these so-called enlightened ones. By the late 16th century, England and Spain were beefing over which version of Christianity was best when James I ascended to the throne of England in 1603. James, a Protestant, was intent on thwarting Catholic-aligned Spain's global denomination by getting in on the rapidly growing colonizing industry. In 1534, the English Parliament declared that the country had no superior under God, other than the British King Henry VIII, who had split with the Catholic Church so he could marry his side piece. So while the Catholic Church had served as an early investor for Spain, Portugal, and the other white empires, Britain didn't have access to the church's seed money. Without the colonizers' version of Shark Tank, the arrogant members of the British elite did not fret. The other countries may have had a head start, but the English were not burdened by faith or religion. They were free to colonize in the name of a superior higher power: cash money. When Queen Elizabeth I granted charters to colonize the North American territories unclaimed by Christians, the first 4 attempts failed. To be fair, the only reason they fell was because of disease, lack of food, lack of navigation skills, and the inability to convince the natives of English superiority. No one knows what happened to the 4th attempt, aptly named the lost colony of Roanoke, but the English kept trying. They truly believed they were going to find the Garden of Eden, with trees dripping diamonds and streams filled with gold. There was no way they could leave all those untold riches to the people who lived on the land. They had to have it. It would be easy to upend the story of America's founding by turning these colonizers into villains. However, the men who hopped on the Susan Constant, Discovery, and Godspeed, the 3 ships chartered by King James's Joint Stock Virginia Company in London, were too incompetent to be characterized as evil. Although they had never mined, farmed, or built anything in their home country, these clowns were still confident they could sail across the ocean and conquer an entire continent sight unseen. Of all the conquering cultures in the world, the English were perhaps the least qualified colonizers, but to their credit, they were gifted in the area of cockiness, if nothing else. Aside from securing the rights to Virginia's gold, silver, and copper mines, the first charter of Virginia charged the colonizers with propagating of Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and to bring the infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility. In other words, they were going to rob these people of their land, culture, and history. But in exchange for an entire civilization, the Brits would introduce the natives to white church music and hats with buckles. Seems like a fair trade-off, no? On April 26, 1607, the 104 English barbarians arrived at the gates of Senecamica, a territory in modern-day Eastern Virginia occupied by 31 individually governed tribes. Because they lacked basic geographical fluency and had an enormous amount of degrees and whites considered the entire east coast of North America, from Canada to Florida to be Virginia, and declared it their own, ignoring the fact that there was an entire functioning civilization here with a government that wouldn't go down without a fight. This area was ruled by King Wassahanika, whom the whites called Powhatan, which was actually a term to use Wassahanika's collective community. As soon as he received word that some pale people were near the shore, Wassahanika dispatched a welcoming committee to greet them with 20 or 30 arrows, as he had done with all the previous boatloads of suspicious-looking people lurking around his neighborhood. After a brief melee, Wassahanika's boys retreated and decided to wait to make their move. From the moment Wasahanika and his crew first encountered these pale-faced Philistines, the natives could tell there was going to be trouble. First of all, this group was going to struggle with food. The Mid-Atlantic region was going through the worst drought that had been experienced in 700 years. Not to mention that their arrival in late April meant it was too late to start planting any crops anyway. Additionally, the spot chosen by the Jamestown colonizers was the worst real estate in the area. Although the brackish water surrounding the settlement on three sides offered protection, by June, they realized that American mosquitoes hit different. They also didn't seem to know how hygiene works, because for some reason, they figured they could relieve their bowels in the same place they gathered their drinking water. Perhaps the Virginia Company's biggest mistake was who they sent to conquer the new land. Unlike Portugal and Spain, who had a head start in the white people discovering things trend, England was relatively new to the colonizing game. Portugal and Spain had a class of explorers and soldiers whose full-time job was conquering. Instead of sending uncouth conquistadors, the British sent wealthy Protestant aristocrats to stake out the area, led by Captain Christopher Newport, whose ranks included Captain John Smith, a celebrated English mercenary who had been wounded in battle, captured, and sold as a slave. As part of the British expedition, Smith was arrested for treason and imprisoned until the ships landed at Virginia and the crew unsealed the orders naming him as the leader of their colony. Despite his having no experience at farming, governing a colony, or leading people, things were off to a wonderful start. Even the few laborers among the group were not accustomed to living off the land, which set the venture capitalist turned pioneers up for a disaster. In his diary, Smith lamented that there were few bars, beer houses, or restaurants in the newly stolen land, forcing the adventurers to survive on boiled water and a pint of wheat and barley per day. Most of their grain supply had been stored on the ship for 26 weeks, providing a great, albeit unorthodox, source of protein, the worms that had infested the food stores. And in another bout of Hebrew, when Captain Newport dropped them off and told them he'd be right back with supplies, the group seemed to forget how long that journey took and didn't even bother to try and plant crops. The hapless British aristocrats sat clueless in a new land, withering away in the Virginia winter, while the Powhatan nation luxuriated nearby in their heated homes. While Newport was on his journey back, Smith was out discovering stuff that had already been discovered, when one day he found himself surrounded by 200 Powhatan men. Thinking quickly, Smith attempted to use his native guide as a human shield, which didn't go over well with the guys with the arrows. Smith was shot in his thigh a little, captured, and taken to Wahasenica. Paramount Chief Wahasenica arrived at the interrogation session in style, wearing pearl necklaces, a fur-coated raccoon, an entourage of advisors, and young women, each with a great chain of white beads over their shoulders, their heads painted in red, and with such a grave and majestical countenance as drove me into admiration to see such state in a naked savage. Wahasenica served Smith a heavy brunch and decided to let him go. As long as the white men kept their distance, the chief of chiefs believed the two groups could coexist in peace, which was a strange concept for the Europeans. The natives had to be up to something, they figured, a theory advanced by Smith, who insisted that the natives were going to eat him until he outsmarted the king of savages and convinced Wahasenica to let him go. But Wahasenica could see that the inept immigrants were struggling and took pity on them. While he didn't know if their faces were so pale because of malaria, dysentery, or that poop drinking thing, the answer was all of the above. He decided to help the settlers out by sending over some food until Newport came back from grocery shopping in England. Back in England, everyone was excited because Newport had returned with bags of gold discovered by the Jamestonians. The investors figured that this whole colonizing thing was a great plan. Not only did the investors donate supplies, but 120 more laborers and settlers joined Newport for his return to Virginia. They were not exactly received by a party when they landed back on the shores. By the time Newport returned with provisions, craftsmen, and crew on January 2nd, 1608, 66 of the original settlers had succumbed to starvation, sickness, or Powhatan's arrowheads. Thankfully, Newport wasn't around when the Brits back home realized that the settlers' supposed gold was actually iron pyrite, literally fool's gold. After they received the first shipment of supplies, the colonists went to work. Apparently, they hadn't learned a single thing about saving their rations, and like any intelligent, civilized society, they once again ate all their provisions and returned to the meager living time they had just survived. You know how it is when people who live in bad neighborhoods start receiving government handouts? To avoid starvation, Newport and the colonists came up with the whitest plan ever created. They were going to go back to Seneca, the emperor of the not hungry Powhatan people, and bestow on him the honor of becoming an English vassal. After all, who in their right mind would turn down the privilege of becoming an honorary white man? There was only one problem with this genius idea. Seneca did not kneel for anyone. You don't become the president of Seneca by kneeling. In fact, Seneca lived by two rules. He who keeps his head higher than others ranks higher, and he who puts other people in a vulnerable position without altering his own stance ranks higher. The whites didn't know what they had coming for them. After crowning Seneca, the settlers demanded more food from their new fellow countrymen. When the colonists informed the chief that he was now a subject of King James I, not only did the Powhatan end their welfare program, but Seneca's warriors surrounded the Jamestown settlement and warned the beggars not to leave their lily-white gated community unless they had some arrow-proof vests. Unable to hunt, fish, or gather food without being attacked, the settlers were back to square one. Word got back to England that the settlement was flailing worse than Kenny G in an HBCU halftime show. Not only weren't they finding any gold, but when they ventured out into countryside and climbed the highest hills in the area, they still couldn't see the Pacific Ocean. Yes, they seriously thought they could find a path to Asia a few miles from their settlement. King James was so determined to save his investment that he issued a new charter for Virginia Company along with a fleet of 9 ships loaded with supplies and 500 colonists. It was the largest fleet ever amassed in the history of the country, until they were separated in a hurricane and yellow fever and the London plague broke out aboard the 2 ships. Then 2 more were lost at sea. By the time the British arrived in Virginia, the supplies were essentially gone, but there were more people to feed. Smith and the Jamestown governors had to instill a campaign of law in order to keep the desperate colonists from turning the English outer suburbs into a ghetto. In October 1609, Smith was asleep on a sack of gunpowder when it accidentally caught fire, burning a 10-inch patch of skin in his groin area. Fortunately, he was on a boat and jumped in the water where he almost drowned. After his transport to England was delayed for weeks, John Smith left Virginia as an utter failure, with nothing to show for his work but a journal, a few stories, and charbroiled genitals. After Smith's unfortunate weenie roast, Seneca summoned Smith's replacement, John Radcliffe, and 25 of Virginia's most important whites to a big dinner and a promise of more Powhatan government handouts. At the banquet, Radcliffe discovered the food baskets were empty and that he had walked straight into a trap. That night, Radcliffe was kidnapped, skinned alive, and burnt at the stake. It was all part of Seneca's plan to rid his land of these pesky whites once and for all by doing what he should have done all along. Let them starve. With his shoddy leadership in shambles, Jamestown was doomed. As the third winter came upon the settlement, the newcomers were at an all-time low, forced to eat leather belts, their pets, and eventually each other. Yes, that's right. Researchers have found evidence that the few remaining Jamestonians survived the period known as the starving time by murdering pregnant women and eating their own children. The heralded first Americans were cannibals. In May 1610, 142 survivors of King James' ill-fated fleet arrived in a ship they managed to build in Bermuda. One of the passengers, John Rolfe, had lost his wife, daughter, and all his belongings in a Bermuda shipwreck. By the time he reached Virginia, all he had was a few tobacco seeds that he had collected in Bermuda. He had heard about the new trend of drinking smoke that was becoming popular in Europe and decided to plant those West Indian tobacco seeds. As it turned out, Virginia's soil was perfect for tobacco cultivation. When Rolfe and company landed, Seneca was still tripping. The #1 chief Rocca had almost successfully starved out the white invaders and still commanded a large native force. When the Bermuda ship arrived, in fact, only 60 of the hundreds of English colonizers were left. But one extremely savage colonist, Deputy Governor Samuel Argyle, had a plan. Argyle was the embodiment of pure evil, known for attacking French and Dutch settlements and claiming them for the king. When Argyle failed at capturing a settlement, he would just resort to Plan B and set it to fire, as he did a Jesuit colony in a French settlement in present-day Maine. Argyle first tried to force Seneca into submission by burning native villages to the ground. When that didn't work, he discovered that Seneca's weakness and it was his daughter Matuka. The white folk called her Pocahontas because, as we have established, they were terrible at names. In April 1613, Argyle kidnapped Matuka by luring her into his ship. He offered to exchange her for English prisoners who had ventured outside the camp. When Seneca agreed, Argyle reneged on the deal and demanded more provisions. Seneca agreed again, but Argyle would never release his daughter. Instead, she converted to Christianity and was married off to Rolfe. It turns out the white conversion plan worked on the second try. Seneca told his warriors to chill out and gave Rolfe thousands of acres as a wedding dowry. In 1614, Rolfe exported a few barrels of his first tobacco crop, and the English loved it. It was the first positive news from the Virginia Company since the fateful incident in 1608. With this success evident, the question became who would farm this new cash crop. The few settlers that remained were not the agricultural type, considering they could barely keep themselves alive. To solve the problem, Argyle took John and Matuka to England for an investor relations trip in 1616. However, the trip was cut short when Matuka died suddenly of an unknown illness. Her tribesmen believed she was poisoned, while some historians think it was a respiratory illness or dysentery. Whatever the cause, Argyle brought the newly widowed Rolfe back to Virginia without a solid plan. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, the Chickahominy natives who weren't under Seneca's confederacy helped feed the lazy British settlers who still hadn't planted enough food to feed themselves. When Seneca died in April 1618, the natives decided to stop offering government assistance to the settlers. Ending this welfare-to-work program would doom the unskilled encroachers. They desperately needed help. The only thing that could possibly save the English colony could be an influx of immigrants who knew what they were doing. Once again, Jamestown was on the precipice of failure. The English investors were demanding their money, but King James didn't have it. Rolfe had landed, but it was essentially worthless because he couldn't farm it. After a summer heat wave, colonists were preparing for a second starving time because investors were refusing to send more supplies until they got paid. In July 1619, the Virginia Company held its first legislative assembly. During the meetings, the assembly decided that if the company was going to survive, the colonists should probably grow enough food to feed themselves. Instead of using 75% of the land to grow tobacco while depending on a native welfare system, America's first white legislative body limited tobacco production to 25% of the plantation's output and decided to give away plots of land to investors. While this plan seems reasonable on its head, the truth was these fools still didn't know how to farm and hadn't even attempted. So to pretend they suddenly understand that and was able to provide for themselves was truly outlandish. There's a word for doing something over and over again and expecting different results. American. This America experiment was pretty much over. With no food, no gold, and rumors swirling around their homeland about their people eating habit. When would they even find a skilled, hard-working people who knew how to build a country from scratch? Certainly not England. You heard what Cicero said? Then James Rolfe's homeboy showed up with some cargo that would save the bumbling British colonists from extinction. On October 12, R13, 1616, Spanish Captain Manuel Mendez de Acuna left Spain with a letter authorizing a private ship to transport kidnapped Africans from Africa to Veracruz, Mexico. Although the San Juan Bautista was only licensed to carry 200 enslaved people, Acuna left La Guanda, Angola, with at least 350 stolen Africans. By the time the 115-ton vessel reached Jamaica, approximately 143 had died. Like most slave traders, Acuna had planned it this way. Human traffickers routinely packed their vessels to maximize profit. In Jamaica, he sold 24 young children and headed for Veracruz, where he declared he was carrying 123 humans as cargo. 60 were missing. Shortly before the San Juan Bautista arrived in Mexico, 25 Englishmen on a small boat had it attacked in July 1619. After stealing 60 of Acuna's stolen cargo, they had split them between the 160-ton White Lion and the 100-ton Treasure. The thievish Brits decided to head for the Virginia colony, where they had no chance of being arrested or attacked. When the White Lion landed at Point Comfort in about the latter end of August, Virginia Governor Sir George Gerardley, along with the colony's supply officer, Abraham Percy, negotiated a dirt cheap price for the ship's cargo, 20 and odd Negroes in exchange for food and the best and easiest rates they could. And with that, the Jamestown Project was saved. This is what made the land worth something. The enslaved labor was worth more than the tales of gold and diamond trees. Now they had a cash crop, abundant land, and people who knew what to do with it. The abject failure of an experiment has transformed into an unprecedented success. But why Virginia of all places? Why would a smuggler bypass more successful outposts to go to a failing colony? How did they know they would be welcome? In a rare case this story is told, it is cast as a tale of happenstance and coincidence. But of course, it is actually one of deception, trickery, and greed. When John Rolfe took his newly stolen wife to England for that investor relations trip, he traveled to England and returned to the colonies on a ship captained by the vicious Samuel Argyle. As soon as they returned, Argyle was summoned back to England to answer charges of cruelty against the colonists and for running an international crime ring. To get back to England, Argyle had to catch a different ride, as his ship was being captained by Argyle's homeboy, a notorious pirate named Daniel Elfrith, who had essentially made a career out of stealing on the high seas. Elfrith had borrowed the treasure from Argyle and hit the jackpot by stealing the stolen Africans from the San Juan Baptiste. 4 days after the arrival of the White Lion, Elfrith sold 2 or 3 Negroes in Virginia. He probably could have sold more, but he had to leave in a hurry as Virginia's new governor, George Yeardley, recognized the ship as a well-known pirate vessel and ordered him to leave. Yeardley couldn't resist purchasing a few low-priced human beings before giving him the boot, though. He just knew that it had to be quick. He didn't want his name sullied for dealing with pirates. Virginia didn't need that kind of trouble. Less than a year later, in March 1620, the Virginia colony's first census recorded 17 women and 15 men who were not Christians in the service of the English. One of them would show up in later documents as Angela, or Angelo, a Negro woman. Angela arrived in America as a passenger of Daniel Elfrith's thieving, enslaving, kidnapping, village-burning, self-contained criminal enterprise, the Treasurer. It was a ship Argyle used to kidnap Mataoka and burn native settlements up and down the coast. It was a stiller of souls that was fueled by greed and theft, and it is as American a thing that ever existed. Here in the folds and creases of the tale of peppered people is where America truly lies. That other mythical history that is shared in schools is as real to me as is Atlantis or Oz. It is a tall tale refined from years of incessant yarn spinning that has been sugar-coated and stuffed down throats. But in the middle room world built by Du Bois and his progeny, we ask the real question to America. How does it feel to be a stiller of men? Or is that the way of the world? 3 little questions. What is the difference between a settler and an invader? Is it A, the number of guns you bring to an invasion? B, it depends on who's telling the story. C. Invaders become settlers after they vanquish the people they invaded. D. Two different spellings. 2. Who were the first Americans? A. The people who were living in the place when the name America was invented. B. The people who came up with the name America but had never been there. C. The people who had united their states in a place called America. D. White people. 3. Rank these savages from least civilized to most civilized. A. People who fought to prevent invaders from stealing their land. B. Human traffickers. C. People who stole from human traffickers. D. People who bought stolen property from human traffickers. E. Cannibals. Activity. Greetings from your future colonizer. As Director of Corporate Communications for the Virginia Company of London, you are tasked with writing a one-page letter introducing the British colonists to Wassahanika. As truthfully as possible, explain the motives, plans, and intentions of your company and in a way that is least likely to result in the ponton putting an arrow through your chest. And that is chapter 1. Whew, the first chapter of Black AF history, the Un-Whitewashed story of America. Whew, the first chapter of Black AF history is just an unapologetic dive into the myths and truths of America's past. Michael uses a lot of hard-hitting facts to expose the whitewashed narratives many of us grew up learning. And what makes this chapter stand out is how it connects history to the present, showing how the erasure of Black stories is still a fight we're waging today. This chapter isn't just a history lesson, it's a call to action. Michael reminds us that history is more than just the past. It's a tool to reclaim power, challenge systems, and preserve our questions. So I have a few questions for you. I would love to see your videos in response to this. You can tag us Black Artist Lit. You can follow me on all platforms at Nykieria. That's Nykieria. So the first question is, what does it mean to you to truly know history? And why do you think some people fear the truth about Black history? 2, if Black history is erased, what do you think the impact will be? Not just on Black communities, but on America as a whole. And 3, what's one story or fact about Black history that inspires you to speak up, take action, or preserve the culture? Thank you for listening to Black Artist Lit. Don't forget, new episodes drop every Tuesday, so mark your calendars. Next week, we'll explore Caste, The Origins of Our Descent by Isabel Wilkinson. Let's continue celebrating Black authors, preserving our culture, and remember, Black art is lit. Thank you, guys.